we aren't getting 120 frames per second with GTA 6 at launch. But before we get into the video, let's just break a few things up. Firstly, 120 FPS is way better for shooting games that are first-person shooters with things happening extremely fast, a lot of action, and where the millisecond really matters when it comes to shooting your opponent. That's really imperative, but 30 frames per second, well actually 24 and 25 frames per second, always looks better from a cinematic perspective for cutscenes and other things alike. That's why pretty much every single cutscene that we'll get in Grand Theft Auto 6 will be at 24, 25, or maybe 30 frames per second. Now we've got that out of the way, let's get into the video. And if you do enjoy this video at any point, please consider liking and subscribing. It really helps me grow the channel. Love you all. So, GTA 6 and the frame rates. This has caused quite a stir online recently, and I've noticed that I'm getting a lot of comments from people asking about it. In this video, I want to go through the concept of frame rates and what they actually mean. And no, I don't mean what forums tell you they mean, I mean what they actually mean. So, in my background in editing and video work, frame rates work slightly differently to how they do in gaming. When filming a video, the frame rate is essentially the amount of pictures taken in quick succession to give the illusion of video. It's nothing to do with the processing power or the display power. But in gaming, it's actually slightly different. The image being portrayed to your screen isn't necessarily still images, it's a subset of samples taken from the game. Yes, they're kind of similar, but for the sake of this video, I want to keep things as simple as possible. Nvidia did a great video explaining frame rates in gaming, so I'm going to refer to it in this video, and of course, there's a link in the description too. Frame rates in gaming, for the most part, are based on GPU performance, effectively how many samples the GPU can/will process in a sequence. There's a slight differentiation here because GPUs are usually more capable than what they run at by default, hence why sometimes reducing gameplay quality can free up some headroom for a GPU, which then can be traded for a higher frame rate. Hence why there are a lot of games that are run at 4K at 30 frames per second and 1080p at 60 frames per second, or 4K at 60 and 1080p at 120. The next thing we need to talk about here is display rate. This is measured in hertz, which is the screen refresh rate. This is effectively how fast the screen can reprocess the image that it's getting fed from the console, the gaming PC, whatever it might be. Your screen's refresh rate will always be your limiting factor. Your GPU could be working at 120 frames per second, but if your screen is working at 30 Hz, you'll perceive more lag. Now, having a 120 FPS screen and a 60 FPS game, the 120 screen will always look a little bit better because it's taking more samples overall from your gaming rig. I don't want to go too much into this because the difference is minuscule, but it's still something I have to say because people in the comments will still tell me I'm wrong. God, I love a good comment section argument. Higher frames per second animations look smoother and have less ghosting. Ghosting is this area behind the character that's blurred due to the motion. And one of the negative side effects of slower frame rates can be issues like tearing. And I don't really want to go into it in this video, but there is a video in the description that explains it a bit better. But we now need to talk about Grand Theft Auto 6 and also some common misconceptions. I almost didn't make this video because some people are so passionate about frame rates, and I know how the comment sections can be on some videos, but we're here. So let's just go through it. Frame per second counts only really make a huge difference in first-person shooter games that are based on the simulation style of gameplay. Call of Duty, CSGO, Rainbow Six Siege, etc. because the characters and your screen whilst aiming down your sights with a weapon needs a faster input signal from a GPU to prevent lag. But Grand Theft Auto isn't a simulator like these other games. Simulation and realism are very different things. No one in the history of Grand Theft Auto has ever played it for its realistic weapons feel. In fact, one of the biggest criticisms Rockstar get is how arcade-like the gun physics are, and when Grand Theft Auto 5 dropped, they doubled down on it and made it even more arcade style and worse than Grand Theft Auto 4. Higher frame rates usually mean that the games feel more responsive because your controller input has a less amount of time for it to get sampled from the console, and therefore it's more likely to get picked up on the next sample pass from the display. Visually, for Grand Theft Auto, we can only really perceive a major graphical improvement from 30 frames per second to 60 frames per second. Whilst we'll still be able to see a large improvement at 120 FPS, the majority of the benefit we'll see is actually felt through the responsiveness of the game, which in games like CSGO and Call of Duty make a huge difference and is a way more pronounced difference. A prime example of this is a graph that Nvidia provided which shows kills versus deaths. As you can see, higher frame rates really do help in first-person shooter games, but in games like Grand Theft Auto, it's not necessarily a big deal. Now, to explain this a little bit better, when aiming down your sights in a game, if you're looking through a scope, a higher FPS means that your movement from looking in one direction to another direction is way more pronounced, and it's way more beneficial for you to be playing at a higher FPS. But if you're shooting in a wider field of view, for example in games like Grand Theft Auto, the difference between 60 frames per second and 120 frames per second, although it's going to be noticeable, it's not going to be a game changer for the outcome of whatever you're doing. But something else I need to touch upon in this video. You know the Grand Theft Auto 6 trailer, the one that we all loved, that everyone thinks is an absolute masterpiece? Well, it's at 30 frames per second. But do you know why that is? The reason why is because 30 frames per second from an aesthetic and a cinematic point of view always looks better. Pretty much every movie you've ever watched at the cinema is usually 24 to 25 frames per second. Now, I'm not going to get into the complexities of the 180-degree shutter rule for filming movies, because although I enjoy the nerdy cinema stuff, this isn't the right video for it. Now, the PlayStation 5 is capable of 120 frames per second, but the drawbacks of running a game at 120 FPS, such as the reduction in image quality, is not always worth the sacrifice, and this can be seen with GTA 5. Now imagine how graphically intense GTA 6 would be. As I said at the start of the video, we won't get 120 frames per second for GTA 6 at launch. However, I do think we may get it for the PS5 Pro that is due to come out within the next 18 months to 2 years, and I think we'll probably get it for PC. Now of course there's many games out there that have variable frame rate, so within the settings of the game you can adjust what frame rate it plays at, and obviously your console will tell you if it's struggling or your computer will tell you if it's struggling. But the reason why I've made this video is not to say that 30 or 60 frames per second is better than 120. Obviously, for gameplay, 120 is a better frame rate. However, what I'm trying to convey in this video is that having a 60 frame per second game won't impact how good it is as a game. In Grand Theft Auto 5, having a frame rate of 120 frames per second versus 60 frames per second won't make a dramatic difference to the outcome of your playing. Although experts find it difficult to agree on a precise number, the general consensus is that the human eye frames per second for most individuals is between 30 to 60 frames per second. And obviously our eyes don't see frames per second, that's not how our eyes work, but our eyes process information at a certain amount of information per second. And that can be translated roughly to a rough FPS figure. And fighter pilots, for example, this figure kind of increases to around the 80 to 90 mark. So obviously they're a lot better at perceiving and reacting fast to information. But I'm 99.9% sure that the majority of people playing Grand Theft Auto 6, and I know this is a bit of a stretch, but most of you aren't fighter pilots. So this video is supposed to be just a bit lighthearted and to kind of dig apart the whole 120 FPS be all end all argument. The game will be fantastic at 60 frames per second. I'd understand a bit of resistance if they came out and said it was going to be a 30 frames per second game. Now a lot of people are probably heading to the comment section right now saying that they've heard the game's going to be 30 frames per second. But there's something really key to understand here. 30 frames per second doesn't necessarily mean it will look like it's 30 frames per second. With video media, 30 frames per second, 60 frames per second and 120 frames per second, you can tell the difference because of the sharpness of movement. But with some games, with the technology that we have available, 30 frames per second can look insanely stunning and it can feel responsive. Now, I have absolutely no idea if Rockstar's going to do this, but you can have frame aliasing, which is essentially where you artificially add frames between frames using AI. A prime example in video work, we can actually slow down 30 frames per second footage by using frame aliasing and frame optimization to add frames between frames artificially, and it reduces that motion blur and it reduces any hazing or ghosting. This is stuff that games developers have done in the past and it has looked really clean, but the technology now is a lot better than some of these games that came out 5 or 6 years ago where this technology is being used. So it's really important to remember here, Rockstar will not put out a product if it's rubbish. Rockstar will not deliver us a bad game because they need to make money out of it. So before people start speculating that we are going to get 30 frames per second, I think it's very likely we'll have a 60 frames per second game with the option to drop down to 30 to make it easier on our consoles within the settings, and I think the PS5 Pro model will be at probably 120 or a standardized 60 frames per second model, and the next gen Xbox game and the PC game will be at higher frame rates as well. But also Rockstar are between a rock and a hard place here. They're building one of the biggest and most complex games that we've ever seen in history and squeezing it into a PS5, which is already old hardware. When Grand Theft Auto 5 came out on the PlayStation 3, you better believe that thing was overheating. It couldn't handle it. So yeah, take everything with a pinch of salt that you're reading online and understand that Rockstar would not deliver the game without implementing some way to make it look better than we think it's going to look at 30 frames per second if it is. And rather than being angry at Rockstar, direct that attention to Microsoft and Sony for their consoles and get them to drop the next gen consoles faster. Thank you all for watching today's video. If you did enjoy today's video, please consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you all in the next one.